Now here we are in characteristic number 13 out of 15, and like I said before, we're really starting to get into the realm of things you don't really have to think about, but they're worth mentioning. We're almost done with the characteristics section. This one has to do with external hammers. You learned in the earlier chapter on the history of firearms how hammers were used first to cause sparks using flint, and later on to ignite a percussion cap, which would then ignite the main powder charge and fire the bullet. This then advanced to detonating the primer on the rear of cartridges once brass cartridges were invented. Now, since we still use brass cartridges, every handgun, every one of them, must drop a firing pin onto the primer hard enough to cause it to detonate when you pull the trigger. That's what the trigger pull is doing. And whether or not you can see a hammer on a handgun, there is something that is acting as the hammer. The first handguns to feature hammers were single-action revolvers. This meant that in order to fire the gun, you had to pull the hammer back with your thumb every time you wanted to shoot. Once the hammer fell, pulling the trigger did nothing. Then came double-action revolvers. This is where the act of pulling the trigger would push the hammer back to allow essentially semi-automatic firing, where the trigger would rotate the cylinder and then drop the hammer once it was in the right position. And then came semi-automatic pistols, where the hammer would be cocked by the recoil of the handgun itself. These pistols, like the 1911 style guns, can be fired in a semi-automatic manner, or once a round is chambered, the hammer can be gently let down manually. In order to fire the gun then, you would need to pull the hammer back until it locks into place using your finger or your thumb, and then pressing the trigger would release that hammer. In most modern semi-automatic handguns, however, and even in many modern revolvers, the hammer has become completely internalized, and it doesn't look anything like the traditional hammer of yesteryear. However, some guns keep their hammers, and that's why I want to discuss them now. There are 3 reasons why a manufacturer would continue to use an external hammer. The first reason is simply because it's necessary for the function of that firearm. So here we have a 1911. This is a single-action semi-automatic pistol, and pulling the trigger does nothing if the hammer's down. You can verify that it's unloaded, but if the hammer is in a relaxed state, then pulling the trigger does nothing. Only once we pull that hammer back and lock it into place does pressing the trigger release the hammer. That's a single action pistol. And so in this configuration, the hammer is required. The physical force of the hammer falling hits a firing pin, and that jumps forward and hits the primer and detonates the cartridge. Now, the other reason why some semi-automatic pistols would continue to use an external hammer even when they don't have to, and I'm referring to the double action category of pistols, is for control. Control can happen or can be offered by an external hammer in 2 ways. The first one is to indicate that the handgun is in a state of being ready to fire as a single action handgun. So the double action, single action category, in these categories you can either lock the hammer all the way back, or you can leave the hammer relaxed forward and press the trigger, which moves the hammer back to a certain point and then releases it. So why is that useful? Well, again, both reasons have to do with control, but the first one is just simply to be able to tell whether that handgun is ready and primed to be fired immediately or not, or whether it's going to take a whole trigger press to bring that hammer back. So if you look at a double action, single action pistol and the hammer's cocked back, then you know it's ready to go. Just a slight touch of that trigger and the hammer is going to fall and detonate the cartridge. However, most internalized semi-automatic combat handguns that do not have external hammers have compensated for that by giving you a visual cue that there is or isn't a round in the chamber. For example, on this Glock, there's a chambering indicator here. And when a cartridge is in the firing chamber, this is moved out to the side a little bit. We're going to go more into the chamber indicator in just a moment, in the next chapter, in fact. But I want to talk about the other primary reason why some people can prefer an external hammer. And the aspect of that, in terms of control, is your accuracy ability. You see, in a modern internalized platform with an internal hammer, the trigger press needs to do a little more work than just simply release a hammer. For example, on this Glock, which is technically a striker-fired single-action pistol, when you press the trigger, there's more mechanical things going on than just releasing its internal hammer, which is known as a striker. It's disengaging a couple different internal safeties, and it amounts to not a hefty trigger pull, but a decent trigger pull of about 5.5 pounds. And that can throw off your accuracy ability. Because when you're trying to press a 5-pound trigger on a gun that weighs less than 1.5 pounds, obviously the act of pressing that trigger is going to cause you to shake that gun a little bit. And that leads to most people's diminished accuracy. However, with the true single-action pistol, like the 1911, when the hammer is back, you have a very light trigger press. And that's why these guns can be very good for competitions, and that's why most people can shoot them very accurately, because it's a very light trigger press. So when you have an external hammer on a double-action, single-action pistol, you have the ability to manually reach forward with your thumb and cock the hammer back, thus decreasing the trigger pull weight significantly, often in half. And so basically, every time you cock the hammer to press the trigger, you're going to be a lot more accurate with that handgun than if you just utilize its double action abilities and pull the trigger in such a way that's going to pull the hammer back and then release it. Now, is this beneficial? For target shooting, yes, you can shoot tighter groups. Usually, it takes less physical exertion and focus and control to shoot as tight of a group with a single action pistol or with a pistol with a cocked hammer than it does with a double action pistol or a pistol with a relaxed hammer. However, in a self-defense situation, is this even relevant in the least? No. There's never going to be a situation where your life depends on deploying a handgun very quickly where you're going to have time to cock that hammer. You're not going to think about it. In that situation, it doesn't matter if the trigger press is 10 pounds or if it's 2 pounds. It's not that big of a deal if somebody is right here on you attacking you. Even in those situations, a lighter trigger is going to be more beneficial, but you would never have time to cock the hammer. So really, all this becomes a moot point, but I had to go through all that explanation so you can at least see why some manufacturers continue to offer external hammers when it seems like such a better idea in terms of the potential for snags or debris to get between the hammer and the firing pin, to have them internalized. The summary of external hammers is this. Most Tier 1 semi-automatic pistols have internalized their hammers for very good reasons. The biggest reason is because hammers are just another sharp edge to get snagged on your clothing as you draw your handgun, or to get caught on something during their firing motion, causing a misfire while you're in the middle of a fight. And with the addition of and increasing popularity of chambering indicators, which I mentioned a moment ago, but which we're going to talk about next, even a portion of the control aspect of having an external hammer becomes obsolete for all guns except those double action and single action guns, which benefit from a lighter trigger press following the first shot.